Welcome. Today's presentation is called Forensics and Incident Response in the Cloud. I am your host, Mark Haupt, Chief Information Security Officer at DataBank. As Chief Information Security Officer at DataBank, I hold over 25 years of extensive information security and information technology experience. I have served as the CISO of DataBank for 4 years. Prior to joining DataBank, I had worked in Fortune 50 financial institutions within the United States, academic environments as both Chief Technology Officer and Chief Information Security Officer. I have also served in healthcare entities and the United States government. I hold a number of security degrees and certifications, including the Masters in Information Security and Assurance, Certified Information System Security Professional, Certified Cloud Security Professional, Certified Ethical Hacker, Computer Hacking Forensics Investigator, Security Plus, and more. I pride myself on being an expert in helping people understand the complex nature of security in what I call a common sense security language. What I do is I help business leaders who are not familiar with security learn how to apply security within their environment. If you wish to contact me directly, you can email me at mhaupt@thirdwire.net, Twitter @mhaupt, or visit our website, databank.com. Today's topic is forensics and incident in the cloud. And what I want to do is I want to walk you through today what exactly is an incident. A lot of people do not understand what an incident is, and your cloud service provider will have a view of what an incident is that is likely different than what you as a customer or as a systems integrator would have. We're going to talk about what is the incident. We're going to walk that through and show how an incident or an event progresses itself into the possibility of using forensics. We're going to talk about what a breach is. Again, another definition type of scenario that we need to be very careful of when we're working in the cloud. We're going to take a look at exactly what kind of applications or what kind of systems become targets and how those problems occur and how that applies to you as a customer of a cloud service provider. We're going to really kind of bring it back together to understand the importance of these definitions, what some of the reasonable expectations you should have of your cloud provider are, and what does incident response and forensics actually look like at a cloud service provider. The idea here is that when you are done, you'll have some understanding, some better education on how to approach your cloud service provider, either as an existing customer or a new customer, so that you can bind them to requirements, that you can work with them in their contracts, your contracts, in a much better way. A few definitions about events, incidents, and even later on we'll talk about forensics and a breach in particular. So first thing I want to do is I want to draw some very distinct lines between an event, an adverse event, and a security incident. These definitions come from the U.S. federal government NIST regulation SP 800-61 revision 2, specifically in section 2.1. An event is an observable occurrence within a system or network. These are the kinds of things that happen all the time. These are things that your computer is logging, success, failures, of access control functions, the different IP addresses that are coming into your web server, the actions that your computer is taking. An event does not necessarily, and really should not necessarily, identify as a problem. It is a potential thing for you to look at, but it is not necessarily a problem. Now, when we move on deeper into this process, we understand that there becomes a function called an adverse security event. Now, this is an observable occurrence that has negative consequences. Now, before you jump to conclusions, understand that not every negative consequence, not every adverse security event is something that you need to look at and identify and worry about either. It could be that you've had multiple failed logins attempts on an Active Directory domain account. Is that necessarily an intrusion attempt? We don't know, but it could be considered an adverse security event. It's something that you need to take a look at. Now, it may stay at an adverse security event function if you contact the individual who's having that login problem and they then say, "Oh no, I've been typing my password wrong. I'm sorry." Okay, we can step back from that now and say, not a problem. But where it crosses that line into a security incident is when there is a clear violation or an imminent threat of violation of a security policy, practice, or process. Now, what this means is that somebody's being very deliberate, or an action that's occurring is going to cause significant problem within your systems. So what I'd like to do is demonstrate how an event moves from an event status to an adverse event to even potentially moving into a security incident type of scenario through the demonstration of a political clip from President Ronald Reagan from back in the early 1980s. Now, those of you that are astute to history will understand that just shortly after Reagan was inaugurated in the United States, there was an assassination attempt on him and he was shot. Sometime after that, within a year or two after that, President Reagan was in Berlin giving a speech. Now, let me show you what happens here. See if you can identify how a political event, a standard function, moves into an adverse event, possibly a security event, and then backs itself down.
By its very existence and character, Berlin remains the most compelling argument for an open world. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy. We're reminded of the many traditions of openness and democracy that have marked the history of this city. America missed me.
So in this clip right here, we see the president giving a typical speech. As he's moving on, a balloon pops in the background. That moves the event up into an adverse event. It's not quite a security incident yet because the security teams are now scanning the environment, looking for an actual threat out there. They didn't see one. The president didn't see one. He quickly sends out a little joke, "Oh, missed me," and backs the event down without having to rip him off stage, without having to enact your entire incident security response process. Now, what this teaches us is that we need to be careful as security practitioners, as business leaders, to ensure that we, in fact, only react to the security event scenarios that are real. Any event could become any adverse event could become a security event. But until you know that that's actually a security incident, you need to be careful. You need to watch it. You need to prepare for it and then react once you see it as a security event. So when we activate our incident response teams, we're pretty certain that there's a problem. We know that there's an issue out there. What are we looking for in that incident response type of scenario? Well, typically we're looking for what's happening, when did it happen, when did it start, when did it end, what's going on now, who possibly caused that to happen, where did it occur, and if you can, why did it occur? Now keep in mind that when an incident response team is activated, there is something bad happening or suspected to be happening. Use a practical example with fire teams, fire departments, fire brigades. Someone's driving down the street. They see smoke coming from the back of a building. They're going to pick up the phone and they're going to call the local emergency teams to come in. Now that smoke may be nothing more than somebody grilling out in the back and enjoying their afternoon, but it could be a fire on a house. Take into the difference there the type of reaction you might have if you're the person driving down the street and you actually see flames coming out of a building. That's going to be a completely different response. You're going to pick up that phone and you're going to call the fire teams in and you're going to say there is a fire, instead there is smoke coming out of the back of the house. Those are two different things. So the fire department wants to know what exactly is happening, just like our incident response teams. When the support department calls us up and says, the server's not running very fast. It looks like maybe the CPU utilization's high. Okay, is that really something that's a security event? Is it the smoke behind the building, or is it a real attack that's going on? We won't know until we get in there. So the what is questionable. So anything that looks like an event can bring in the incident response teams at the adverse event level to check it out. Check out that smoke. Check out that high CPU utilization. We may enact a small triage type of incident response team to determine that. This is the type of situation where they're going to come in and they're going to find out what's really going on. What we're going to determine that what type of scenario. Usually these teams will follow a very clear process to either correct the problem or identify the problem. And that process also, I went back to the definitions in NIST earlier. That process is also defined in the same document, NIST SP 800-61 Revision 2. It's the second time you've heard me talk about it. It's probably a good document for you to go pull down. They're free and you can take a look at it. But in that document, it identifies an incident response process where you prepare, you detect an incident, you stabilize the incident, you recover from an incident, and you have an after action report that's related to those incidents. Hey, we saw smoke in the back. We went and checked it out. The high CPU utilization smoke was not really from an attack incident. It was related to this. We passed it back to support. Or we went and checked out that high CPU utilization. It actually was an attack and actually was a fire going on. We called in the rest of the incident response team and we reacted accordingly and did this. Those are the types of things that occur in this after action report. So now that we understand what the different terms of incident response are, we've seen a practical demonstration of an incident response process. We've worked ourselves through that. We're now ready to start talking about forensics. An incident response is a progressive leader to forensics, which is why we spent so much time on incident response scenarios. And one of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, when do we need forensics involved in an incident response scenario? So the first thing we need to understand is that forensics is typically a legal type of scenario. When we engage forensics, even though it's very technical with ones and zeros, bits and bytes, and we're taking that image exactly how it is on the system, our end goal is to present that data as evidence either within our own organization or to an external party, law enforcement, military type of scenarios, in order for an action to be taken. And most of those external third parties, even most internal third parties, like a human resources department, are going to want solid evidence to the case or the accusation that's being put forward with forensics. So one of the things we need to first look at is, when do we need forensics? So events happen, security events, these events happen on our systems all the time. So the question is, do we need forensics for events? My argument is no. There's no need to forensically investigate an event as we've defined it within the incident response process. If we did, we would be investigating events all day long. Every day we would have teams of people doing nothing but investigating events. So where do we get in? So let's start taking a look at adverse security events. Is that an area where we need to investigate? Well, possibly we do. This is what I call the gray area. So these adverse security events are typically easily traceable back to their source. The incident response process has determined the who, the what, the when, the where that an item may have occurred. So what we would use forensics for within an adverse security event is to either back up what the incident response team has already identified, or look for things that the incident response team has not been able to find. For example, if someone has admitted to, or we've identified through the incident response scenario that someone within your company, an insider if you will, has changed data within a database, maybe we want to take a look at forensics here and determine Were they the only ones? Did they take that data and exfiltrate that data from the system, from the network? Is there something else that the incident response team missed in that process? So that's where forensics could be used for an adverse security event. Now, where you're almost certainly going to find forensics most frequently used is during the security incident process. Now, again, not every security incident is going to require the use of forensics. In the security incident scenario, we already have determined the who, the what, when, and the where from the adverse security event function. We've probably gone deeper in that after we brought everyone in. We've got a real fire going on here, back to the analogy that we used earlier. But maybe some piece of the function of incident response is not clearly identifying a who, what, when, or where. Maybe we've identified that the incident occurred on a particular server at a particular time, but we can't identify who did it. Who was logged into the machine at that time, who was using certain credentials. Maybe it needs to expand beyond the size of that server. So you can look at using forensics for that purpose. But more importantly, is you can also use forensics to either rule in or rule out a data breach type of situation. And when you're dealing with data breaches, these are things that you want to have your forensics team brought in to take a look at. So let's take a look at data breaches for just a moment and how that plays into forensics and incident response. So data breach laws, we have to understand, differ in every single country around the globe. In fact, in the United States, they differ within each state, within the European Union, though they have some pretty clear understanding of data breach function at the EU level. Every state, every member of the union has a different breach law, or potentially has a different breach law that goes above and beyond the federal laws that exist. So some of these breach laws, such as those in the United States, in particular in California and in Texas and in Massachusetts, require notification to the individual whose data was breached. That also exists with Pipeda in Canada and in France with a few laws as well. So one of the things that we want to work with when we're dealing with a cloud service provider is, going back to our understanding of the incident response scenario, we want to take those definitions and apply them to our MSAs and our contracts. We also want to have a good understanding between ourselves as the customer and the cloud service provider of what a data breach is. Here's a definition that I use. A data breach is a confirmed incident. So going back to our definition of a security incident, so it's a confirmed incident. It's not something that's suspected. It's not an event. It's not an adverse event, but it's actually a confirmed. We know this has happened. We know who's, what, when, where, and how has done it. Confirmed incident in which sensitive, confidential, or otherwise protected data has been accessed and or disclosed in an unauthorized fashion. Now, that latter part there is just as important as the preamble, the first part talking about the confirmed incident, because you could have a confirmed incident on a server but not have a breach of sensitive or confidential information. Let me give you an example. A few years ago, one of our customers had a server on our environment, as we're a cloud service provider, had a server on our environment, and one of our internal people had gotten authorization to do something on that server. When he did what he was authorized to do on that server, it caused the website to go down. Portion of our customers' incident response team immediately activated, trying to find out what happened. They came to the conclusion that our internal cloud service support person accidentally had shut down portions of the website. Now, at the time that they were running incident response, they did not know that the person was authorized. So they were viewing that as an unauthorized access of their system, and they were viewing it as a malicious attack in shutting down their website. So being that they were a medical customer and had to comply with HIPAA laws, they immediately jumped to a conclusion that they had a data breach on hand because on that server was medical data, electronic protected health information, EPHI, as defined by HIPAA. What they failed to do is they failed to go and look, forensically or otherwise, to determine whether or not that data itself had been accessed by the individual who did what he was authorized to do and accidentally shut down the website in that process. They get me on board as the CISO, their lawyer on board. We're talking through this. And I said, look, has data actually been compromised? Has the data been removed from the system? Has an external third party accessed the data itself? There were no logs whatsoever. In fact, I had logs opposite that showed exactly what was done on that server. There's nothing on that server where the EPHI was accessed. So I challenged their lawyer and said, please explain to me how this is a data breach in which you're going to have to notify people if in fact none of the data was actually breached. The lawyer had to agree with me. And finally, we came to a conclusion that yes, we had a confirmed security incident on hand, but because we had this definition in place of what data breach was, we were able to confirm that there was actually no breach involved, and we did that through the use of forensics. So let's just take a quick moment and take a look at where some of these breaches occur and what their targets are. There may be some surprises here for you and really kind of change your mind about where you need to be looking for a potential breach. So Trend Micro, probably a number of us use their products or are aware of Trend Micro and the services that they render in the intrusion protection systems and their vulnerability management and vulnerability identification scenario. So these guys are really good source of information, even if you don't use their products, to identify what's going on out there in the security attack world. So they identified that between 2005 and 2015, the target of a data breach was most likely to be personally identifiable information. That probably in itself is not a shock. We know that credit card data is breached. We know that people's addresses and cell phone numbers and email addresses, dates of birth, and all those kinds of things, their medical records, are being breached over and over and over again out there in the wild. But what is most interesting to me is where the breaches come from. And if you look at this graph that they've identified here and you really kind of analyze the data that's in there, if you took a glance at it, you would say, oh, well, yeah, 25% of the attacks come from hacking or malware. That's not unexpected at all. But let's move down a little bit in this and realize that almost 70% of the attacks that occur are occurring because of human factors and human failures. Portable device loss. So somebody loses their laptop, they lose their iPhone, their cell phone, their iPad, their tablet, whatever the case may be. Unintended disclosures are when somebody's sending out an email, it's not caught by a data loss prevention tool. Insider leaks, when somebody's deliberately exfiltrating data from an environment. Notice I keep saying somebody, somebody, somebody. Physical loss is when somebody has physically lost a hard drive or has physically lost a thumb drive or somewhere else where the data is. Stationary device loss, meaning possibly something like a hard drive has been lost that's associated with a photocopier or a printer type of situation. So all of those things there involve somebody not following processes, not following policies, and resulting in loss 70% of these items. So here's the thing, if you, regardless of whether you're dealing with a cloud service provider or not, you're just dealing with your own inside people, you have to factor in that 60 to 70% of any kind of risk that you have for an attack or loss of scenario, loss of integrity in your data resulting in a data breach is going to come from the inside in some way, shape, or form. Now, when you move your data out to a cloud service provider, you're not only dealing with your own internal people, but you have to deal with those external policies of that organization as well. And if you've got 100 people in your organization, the cloud service provider probably has 100 people in their organization as well. So what you need to do in your contracts and in your thought processes, your risk analysis, is take this into consideration that 70% of the scenarios that are going to result in data breach are going to come from people, and they're going to come from people with that are kind of close to you, if you will. And you have to worry about that. You have to consider that as you move forward. So in doing that, let's just take a quick look again at all these definitions we've dealt with and why they're important. What we've done is we've kind of spent the last 20 minutes or so dealing with building a firm foundation for you to move forward with your cloud service provider. Anybody that's ever dealt with building a building before, or building a structure, knows that you need to start with a solid foundation, and those are usually started with what's called a cornerstone. That cornerstone is exactly the 90 degrees that you need, and you build either direction off that. And that's kind of what we've just done with these definitions. Although it may have been a refresher for some of you, that's important. And what you need to do is you need to take these now and apply it to your cloud service provider, because a lot of your cloud service providers are going to have their own definitions of these terms with their goal, sorry to say, coming from a cloud service provider, but their goal is to minimize the impact upon their organizations. So, defining what an event is and who has that responsibility, and defining what a security incident is and who has responsibilities there, is very, very important for you moving forward in contracts. Understanding who is going to do the forensics, exactly what forensics is, and how it might impact your cloud service provider contract is important from day one. You need to be prepared walking into your negotiations with your CSP, and you need to be having those kinds of things in your SLAs and in your contracts. Otherwise, if you're going to wait until an attack occurs, and we're going to wait until an incident occurs, you're going to wait till you need forensics, you're going to have a problem rushing around, agreeing on certain things, agreeing on how to deal with those types of environments. And frankly, you're going to have a lot of finger pointing that is unnecessary if you build your relationship with your CSP upon this firm foundation with a cornerstone of these definitions being in place. You will have a much better time dealing with them. So let's look at some reasonable expectations that you should have and your cloud service provider should have of you. So we've already looked at defining the terms, and we need to look at defining boundaries. We need to define the responsibilities, and we need to document an actual incident response plan. So, defining the terms, as I've said over and over again, and when it's repeated, it's important. You must define these things in your contracts, your MSAs, your statement of work, your SLAs, your service level agreements. All that kind of language needs to be defined within those types of scenarios. If you don't do so, you're going to have problems. I would argue that both sides of you need to use industry standard referenceable terms. So you'll notice in my presentation, I referred back to NIST SP 800-61 revision 2. That way, neither side can claim that one side or the other is just making these things up as you go along. You need to have them as referenceable terms that are industry standards. The other thing I would argue as a cloud service provider, CISO, is that you need to make sure your expectations are reasonable. So the cloud service providers are going to try and minimize their responsibilities, no doubt. But one of the reasons that they minimize and try to minimize their responsibilities is because there's so many customers out there that try to maximize the responsibility of the CSP. And that is not always the best solution. nor is it the best effort on the part of the customer. There needs to be reasonable expectations that meet in the middle. And we'll talk about that a little bit in just a few moments. But the other reason you need to come to the table with reasonable expectations is because the cloud service providers, who are typically the ones that are going to present you with the contract, they know their contract and their intents behind that contract already. They've had their lawyers looking at it over and over again. Not only that, a CSP that's got 1,000 customers has been through redlining and having conversations and debates with other lawyers and other entities 1,000 times. You're number 1,001, and they're going to look at some of your stuff and they're going to go, absolutely not happening. We are not going to allow that. And they're going to look at other pieces of it and they're going to be like, well, why are they not asking for this or not asking for that? So the CSP knows their contract and the intents. So when you come in with unreasonable expectations, they're going to knock out as much as they can when they can, when it's considered on their part as unreasonable. So joint efforts are expected and appreciated by the cloud service provider. So when you come in with expectations of getting some things done and doing it in a joint fashion, we as cloud service providers appreciate that and work with you much closer on that. So what are some reasonable expectations regarding boundaries? This is one of the things that customers and cloud service providers clash on all the time. I've had more than one customer come in, operate with us for a couple of years until an incident occurs, and then they get on the phone and they say, why is X, Y, and Z not done? Well, Mr. Customer, that's inside your boundary. That's your responsibility to handle. And all of a sudden they're shocked because they believe that when they came to the cloud service provider that it was a turnkey solution. That is just not the case. There are certain boundaries that things never are relieved of duties by the customer, and there are other boundaries that the CSP always has to have. So both parties should be able to provide a boundary statement and a boundary map. Now, typically your cloud service provider is going to provide you with their SSAE 18, which inside of that has what's called a system description. If you as a customer do not have a similar document, a similar SSAE 18 or ISO 27001 type of audit that has this system description within it, I highly recommend that you take the time to sit down and define and build a document that's just your system description. The SSA 18 describes the company's background, how long they've been in business, how many operations they've had, so on and so forth. They provide an overview of the services that they offer. So in our organization, for example, we offer a lot of services, but really under two different silos. One is co-location services and the other is managed hosting services. And if you as a customer coming into our environment asking for co-location services, you need to understand the incident response responsibilities, the forensic responsibilities that you have that are different from those of the managed services environment. And the reason is in co-location, in a co-location type of environment, a customer is responsible for most everything except for physical security in that type of environment. But on a managed services type of environment, there's added things where the CSP is responsible with networks and if depending on whether it's infrastructure or platform as a service, how deep we go into the actual operating system stack and so on and so forth. So understand the overview of the services that are being rendered to you by your cloud service provider so that you can in turn react to and understand what your responsibilities will be in that. Understand the physical locations where services will be rendered. This is a huge thing that a lot of people don't understand, because where the services are rendered is the jurisdiction in which the law applies. A lot of people don't understand that just because you're a company in Europe does not mean that a company that's solely in the United States must comply with GDPR. Or if you're in the United States and your company is in California, that does not mean that a company in Texas must comply with notification requirements and such of California, simply because the jurisdiction of where the information resides, where the services are being rendered, is absolutely important. So you need to be looking at that as where is it happening, and a reasonable expectation of services rendered there. Understand who their key people are involved. If they're missing a CISO or someone that's a chief compliance officer or another title that you're looking for, find out why. Does the company not care about security because they don't have someone who is ultimately responsible for security within the organization? Maybe they don't have a CTO. Why would a cloud service provider not have a CTO? Well, they may be called something different. So dig into that and understand what people are involved in their titles in the boundary scenario. Another thing you should be looking for is this boundary map. It's a logical network map or a logical map of physical systems. For example, the security controls that are applied to a physical environment. And if you're doing a managed services type of environment, you're going to want to see those expected data flows as well, because those will factor into your incident response process and your forensics later on. They will factor in this way. If you are a managed services customer and you're in charge of the platform, the operating system, and the application, you need to know how to get a hold of and get in control of information that may have passed through the network leading up to that environment. So noting what those data flows are and being able to communicate with your CSP on what they are is very, very important. So again, going back to what we said on the first slide of this section, expect joint responsibility in these spaces. There are things that you're going to have to be responsible for. There's things that other people will be responsible for. So responsibilities as far as actual defining the reasonable expectations with responsibilities. Both parties should define what their expectations are in an incident response, a forensics type of investigation. Here's a whole series of questions that you should be asking yourself. Who's in charge in an incident or a breach? Does that transfer from one to the other once different things are confirmed? For example, if you're a managed services customer and the CSP is in charge of incident response until they find out that the data has been breached, then they turn it over to you as the customer and say, hey, your data has been breached. We've identified it right here, the who, what, when, where, and how. You now need to take it from here because you are probably the data owner. So that's another thing you need to identify. Who is the data owner? Most laws require that the data owner is the originator. And it never transfers to the CSP. I don't know any cloud service providers, CSPs, that are going to allow the transfer of ownership of data from a customer to themselves, because usually the CSP is at most a data processor. So you need to ask yourself, who declares a breach? Do you want the CSP declaring a breach for you? Or would you prefer that CSP step back, allow you to declare that? Because once that's declared, there potentially are notification requirements that go to government entities, that go to legal entities, law enforcement entities that you may want to control. All these other questions here, who actually conducts the incident response, who contracts for a forensics team, and so on and so forth, who contacts law enforcement entities. Another one, you don't want those kinds of things getting out of control. So define those up front so we all understand what's going on. Another reasonable expectation that you should take control of is creating an incident response plan. Almost every CSP out there will have an incident response plan that exists for their environment that you will need, as the customer, you will need to build upon. So a joint incident response plan should exist, one that's built upon their incident response plan to identify exactly what's going to go on with the system that you're involved in. Now you can go download an attachment document, a system security plan attachment document. It's attachment 6 from the FedRAMP website. So fedramp.gov, underneath templates and documents, there's an incident response plan. They call it the Information System Contingency Plan template that you can go and download. This will ask a lot of the questions that you need to have asked. Make sure that whenever you create this plan, that it's published and that it's got C-level, your CISO, your CEO, executive sign off, and ensure that that baseline is is based on the cloud service provider. Using just the CSP plan is not enough for both parties. You need to have one that includes both aspects of your environment. Another key thing that a lot of people forget and should have reasonable expectations with their CSP on is reviewing and maintaining the plan at least annually. So drill it. Insist that the CSP prove that they have drills and planned exercises. Go ahead and pay the extra, a couple extra dollars for consulting fees to have a 1 hour tabletop exercise that includes your CSP security team or their engineering team that's involved. Then once you've created the plan, don't forget to communicate the plan. So many people will create these massive, nice, wonderful plans that have all sorts of data in them and then think, well, this is never going to happen. So they put it on a shelf somewhere and nobody knows where it exists whenever an incident does occur. And especially the person who put it on the shelf goes on vacation, on PTO, and oops, it's gone. It's sitting on a shelf somewhere and nobody knows where it's at. So make sure you communicate the plan widely within your organization. So I'll give you a little bit of an idea of what incident response and forensics actually looks like at a cloud service provider if you haven't gotten that already from a couple of the examples I've shared and some of the things that are contract or that I've identified here with us. So in the discussions about contracts. So most CSPs, most cloud service providers are running very lean on personnel, and those personnel are already tasked with a number of efforts: daily monitoring, building new environments, new systems, bringing new customers on board, things like that. They're very lean and very heavily tasked. So that's one thing you need to consider when you're talking to your CSP is exactly how many people you have on a team. What's your overhead look like? So again, working with the CSP, they're likely going to have defined things that are for their way, and they're going to stick within those limits unless you identify differently. So what this means is they're going to have their own boundaries. They're going to have their own expectations for incident response. They may define the who, the what, and the when, but not the where and a few other factors within an incident response scenario. And they're going to stick within those limits because everything outside of that limit costs them money and costs them time, or costs them time, which equals money. And so they're going to stick with inside those limits that they're contractually obligated, or through an SLA or otherwise, that they're going to communicate with you. So they're not going to go outside of their boundaries, and typically, unless you've told them differently, they're not just going to by default spend a lot of time on incident response. Their focus on incident response is going to get you back online. And typically, to be honest with you, when a customer calls a cloud service provider and says, I've got an incident going on, or I got a potential security incident going on, I would say 8 out of 10 of those customers don't really care anyway. They want to get back online. So that's one of the reasons that the focus of the CSP is by default rapid recovery, getting back online, is because most of their customers, they just want to get back online. Most of their customers are not thinking that, oh gee, I've been attacked and I may have to deal with this again if all I do is recover and get back online. Let me give you a practical example of that. About 2 years ago, we had a situation where a customer servers got impacted by crypto mining tools. Their focus was, let's determine how this occurred. Great, and then let's get back online. A security team did that for them, got them back online, gave them a whole bunch of preventative options, as well as patching systems and what you need to do to prevent this in the future. A month later, the very same thing happened again. Crypto mining was found on a series of servers, and they were down. Both times they were more concerned about rapid recovery, getting back online, than they were about identifying the problem and preventing the problem in the future. After the second time, that's where we as a cloud service provider kind of put our feet down and said, look, Here's what's going to happen. This is the end of the line. So this is going back to the item there about sticking to limits. This is the end of the line of us digging into this. For free or for, as part of your SLA for managed services, because you're now not listening to what we're telling you to do. You're not listening to our advice on how to prevent this in the future. So every single involvement with this type of thing in the future is going to cost you $200 an hour. That woke them up. Then they said, okay, let's definitely take a look at this. Let's shift from that rapid recovery focus to let's get some of our systems back online, but let's go ahead and dig into what it takes to prevent this in the future. So there's ways to work it. So again, so the previous one there was this that's what kind of occurs. Here's some reality of it as well. We talked about the CSPs being lean. Uh, they will likely have defined things of what they'll do, but there's limits to what they'll do. So in those limits, they're going to look at possibly a cursory review of the log files. They're going to point you to their dashboard where log files might already exist that you could download and take a look at. A CSP in their right mind will never do forensics. And this is coming from a CISO who has a background in forensics within CSPs. CSPs should never be doing forensics. And we'll get to talking about that in a minute. Partly because we're limited on tools. Forensics tools are very expensive. And it's easier to restore your backups and get you back online. So what you as a customer should insist on is, if you are contracted for incident response services, the cloud service provider should conduct a cursory incident response program that tells you the who, the source of the event, what happened, when did it occur, where did it occur, and how did it occur. Okay, that's something you should definitely look for if you've contracted for incident response services from your cloud service provider. Again, there's different kinds of cloud service providers. There's different kinds of providers. If you're strictly a co-location provider, then you probably are not going to expect these kinds of things unless you're dealing with a physical intrusion. So if you are a co-location customer, don't forget that these can be useful. This process can be useful within within the co-location environment as well. So you should expect access to log files from your environment, and you should expect access to forensically sound copies of the systems that are not the shared systems, but your systems within the environment. And you should expect honest and technically accurate and timely communication. Okay, so forensic analysis, and here's going back to 2 slides ago where I said we'll talk about it in a minute with forensics and why a CSP should never do forensics. Forensic analysis is an art. I've done it before. I've done it many times. It is very specialized. It requires a lot of tools, and some of them can be very expensive. It does require a high degree of skill and, frankly, determination as well. A forensics investigator must be able to dive in, dig in, and keep going every single time he finds a roadblock or she finds a roadblock. So they should not be the type of person that should give up easily. You should be hiring a specialized forensics investigator and one that understands the cloud, so that there's not finger pointing that goes on. If the CSP were to hire this forensics investigator for you, that forensics investigator would be beholden to initial reports going to the CSP, communications going to the CSP, and so on and so forth, and not you. So you want to hire that professional so that the reports go to you, so that the communications come to you. Instead of going to the CSP directly. Because if you find something that the CSP did wrong, you want to be able to analyze that and have a third party that states that and not you. Otherwise, you get that finger pointing type of scenario going on. Likewise, you want to protect any sort of confidential or proprietary information if they find something wrong within your application or within the way that you have set up the server that led to the event. You want to be able to know that without the CSP knowing that, or without another entity knowing that. Just really pulling that back. You should also have a legal team on retainer to address any of the items in the report. Again, going back to what I said many slides ago, forensics is resulting in legal actions or law enforcement actions in most cases. So you want to be able to have that legal advice on tap. The other thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have contact mechanisms for local and national law enforcement entities so that you can address anything that comes up in that report, again, in the proper way as you move forward with that type of scenario. So make sure that you're the one that's contracting for that forensics to reduce the finger pointing, to ensure that you get the reports, you get the communication, and you have control over what happens to that information. So in summary, what we really need you to know from this is that there are specialized terms that are for incident response and forensics, and you should be using those terms that are industry standards, and you should have those in your contracts so that they are very clear. You need to have a documented incident response plan that includes forensics actions. You need to have your CSPs, you need to understand that they are not turnkey solutions and that you as a customer have responsibilities within that incident response and forensics process. And finally, the forensics should be done by a professional, and it should be done by a third party. It should not be a member of your team, should not be a member of the cloud service provider's team, but it should be someone that you as the customer have hired. And you should have plans in place, agreements in place with your CSP that allow for that forensics analysis to take place. All right, so after